I read Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson for the Summer of Cosmere, where I'm reading every story in the Cosmere, the short stories, the graphic novels, and the novels, all of it in the published order. So I'm going to be talking about the connections between Warbreaker and the Elantris stories and the Mistborn trilogy, the first one. So Warbreaker is like the weird stepchild of the Cosmere. It's one of my favorite books in the Cosmere, honestly, because it just turns so many things upside down. It just like takes everything that we've seen in the Cosmere and just messes with it. And it has these really crazy magic system and characters and stuff that we just could not have guessed was out there in this magical universe, I think. And so I guess the 10,000 foot view of Warbreaker is that it's the story of two princesses who are sent from their home kingdom to that is like a religious conservative kingdom to a differently religious and ostentatious kingdom in order to create peace between these countries, but actually there's an inevitability of war, and the princesses do everything that they can to save both countries. And so we follow the older sister, Vivenna, who was raised to be married off to the god king of Halandren, that's like the ostentatious, crazy, tropical kingdom. And Vivenna is from the conservative mountain kingdom. She is like the studious, older sibling of the family. She's like buttoned up. She's always right. She's the perfect person. And then her little sister, Ciri, is like the youngest one in the family. And she's like the goofball. She's the one who is rebellious and doesn't take anything seriously. And she has no kind of purpose in the royal family. She hasn't, like, some of the other siblings have become like religious devotees or, warriors or whatever. But Ciri, like, is just loosey goosey. She's just all over the place. And the king decides that he just cannot stand to send Vivenna, his perfect daughter, off to the nightmare god king who is like the worst person in the world. And instead, he's going to send Ciri, his youngest daughter, the rebellious daughter, the one who infuriates him. He's going to sacrifice her instead. And so when Ciri is sent away, Vivenna takes up a quest to go to Halandren and make all of this right. She's going to rescue her sister and she's going to take her place because she feels like she has spent her entire life learning how to be the queen to the god king, and that she has known her entire life that there's going to be the threat of war between the nations, and that she needs to convince the god king to not destroy her country by going to war with it. And so she considers like she's going to have a unique place by being married to the king. She's going to have a lot of power in his court, and that's going to allow her to save her home country. And her father kind of preemptively thwarts her plans by taking away her place as the one who's promised to the god king. So she needs to go get it back. And Ciri just like can't believe what's happened to her. She's just completely bewildered by the whole thing. And she's thrust into this bizarre kingdom that has a totally different culture than hers. She's so used to being considered crazy and wild for wearing a little bit of color, for, having a little bit of a shorter skirt than everybody else. But here in Halandren, I mean, just everybody has the loudest colors you could imagine, the lowest cut dresses with the highest skirts, and on and on and on. And so she seems kind of like mousy and conservative, where, like she used to be the loudest and proudest person on the block. So everything is just kind of like turned on its head for her. She doesn't know who she is in this place. And that's a big part of what this book is about. Like, who are we? How is our identity composed? And part of where our identity comes from, according to the story, I think, is these jobs that are laid out for us by our, responsibilities, in this case within our family, but also our vocation, I guess, since they're both princesses. They consider it their duty to marry this king and negotiate a peace between the countries. And so that's a part of who both Vivenna and Ciri are. But also, who is around us? Who are we with? Is part of what makes us up as people. And I think the book does a really beautiful job of illustrating this as both Vivenna and Ciri evolve through the book. I think there's an idea in our culture that there's some kind of essential core truth to who an individual is as a person, and that you could throw them into kind of like any context, maybe at any time in history, and they would kind of be the person that they are. And maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. I'm a little bit doubtful of that. I think that it really, really matters who is around us at any given time. And that has to do with like friends and enemies. I think that we can really find the boundaries of what we are capable of given the people who we interact with in our life. And so maybe we come with those boundaries kind of pre-built, but also maybe those boundaries can be moved or can kind of stretch and grow based on who we know as well. And so I think in the concept of the novel, Ciri was this crazy, wacky rebel in the context of her conservative mountain culture. But now that she's down in the tropical valley, she is mousy and conservative, and everybody else is wild and crazy. And she didn't change that much. What changed was the people around her, and that kind of redefined how she is perceived. And in turn, it changes how she perceives herself. And so that's kind of the interplay of identity. It's not just simply a core thing that you carry around with you, but it has something to do with society itself and how we fit into the spaces around us and the people around us and so on and so forth. But these two sisters have been raised to believe many, many things about the world, and especially about Halandren and how evil it is and how terrible it is. And a similar thing that they go through early on in the book is encountering all of the colors and music and food of the tropical kingdom and being surprised by how much pleasure there is in all of that and how beautiful everything is, and the response that they have to beauty, like as an innate, uncontrollable reaction. They both experience a level of pleasure that they feel guilty about and feel conflicted about because of what they've been told. And this is one of those things that I think really starts to turn the Cosmere on its head, and all the things that we've kind of like learned, quote unquote, by reading the first 4 books in the short story of Elantris. Because I kept talking about how there's these like hard limits of morality. There's definitely a spectrum of good and evil in the Cosmere, and people land in those spaces of good and evil due to crossing lines of behavior, and that goodness and badness are not relative to like your particular viewpoint, right? Like in Mistborn, We got to be in the head of Marsh while he is being dominated by Ruin. And when he sees the ash mounds blow up and he sees the destruction of the world, or he's committing murder, he feels like a deep beauty and a kind of ecstasy about whatever he's experiencing. That's something like what Vivenna and Ciri feel when they're in Halandren and seeing like all the vibrant colors and the wonderful foods and the just completely different culture. They experience this kind of beauty and pleasure that feels similar, but I think that we as readers understand that there's a stark moral difference between those two things, right? That there's a perversion to the perspective of Ruin, that it experiences what is evil as good. And so we should not misunderstand that good is merely a kind of perspective that, Ruin sees good in what is evil, and therefore, evil is good and the world is topsy-turvy. No, there's irony there. We, the reader, don't join in on that feeling of beauty and goodness. Instead, we are repulsed by it. We experience it ironically. And so goodness is not a perspective, except in Warbreaker, it kind of is. And I think what we're doing here is kind of exploring the boundaries of, well, how much goodness is there? Like, what are the limits of goodness? And can cultures be different and still be good? Or is there only one way to be? Are there many ways to be good? Or is there just one way to be bad? And we just kind of start to explore the limits and boundaries of that a little bit more. It kind of troubles this idea that I made a claim on, that there's like a stark good and evil. Instead, Vivenna and Ciri have been taught, Halandren is a cesspool of evil and ostentation. And oh my God, they wear bright colors. Can you imagine the horror? They eat delicious foods whenever they want. They worship undead gods. Well, that one's a little weird, actually, but we'll get back to that. But you can kind of see what I'm saying. Like, is that stuff really bad? Not really. And in fact, it might actually be good. And so maybe Vivenna and Ciri's culture and the religion that they come from is a little bit like too much of an overreaction in some ways. A little bit too conservative, a little bit too dry and musty. And that doesn't make it evil, and it still has good things about it, but that the things that it is claiming are evil are not actually really evil. And so I made this claim about like Ellen Venture, right? That he follows his conscience. He listens to a kind of interior compass when it comes to his behavior, and that he doesn't allow himself to be kind of boxed in by the institutional rules of the various religions, either in the Final Empire or in his constructed republic. Instead, he follows what he feels is the best way to be. And then he just kind of like lets people take that how they will. Well, Ciri and Vivenna here at the beginning of the book have a genuine feeling of disgust with Halandren that sits on top of their feelings of pleasure. And they have like, there's the alchemy of those feelings produces guilt in them. And so Vivenna is really disgusted and pushed away by all of the bright colors and the fashion styles of people in Halandren. But eventually she comes to, stop wearing skirts and wears trousers and wears a tunic and puts on bright colors and allows color to enter her hair, and on and on and on. So there's something about all of that stuff that she's been taught is bad that she allows into herself. There's an attraction that she has to it that leads her into accepting it, and that she overcomes her feelings of disgust, her rejection of the culture, and starts to integrate it into who she is. And so the point of me saying that is that if Elend is a kind of example in the Cosmere of someone who is a good person because he follows his interior feelings about a situation, despite whatever the cultural opinion or propriety would be in a given situation, Vivenna has these feelings that she should reject the culture of Halandran. She has these feelings of disgust. She has these feelings of outrage. And yet those feelings would be inappropriate for her to follow in terms of like, a right or wrong kind of designation. She has certain prejudice or bigotry towards the people of Halandran, and that's the problem in her character. It's those reactions that she's having to their culture, that those interior feelings that were a virtue in Elend are actually the problem in this book. And so the kind of claim that I made in the Mistborn trilogy that like, hey, there's good and evil out there, and just always let your conscience be your guide. Just find your little Jiminy Cricket and listen to that dude, and you're going to be cool. You're always going to land on the side of good. Warbreaker says, no, you won't. Because if you are raised to be a bigot and you follow your internal feelings, you're going to be a bigot. And that's not good. And for all of the political machinations that happen and all of the reversals and betrayals and learning about the magic system and the journey that Vivenna goes on, I think the core conflict that she works out by the end of the book is an internal conflict that has to do with reversing that bigotry inside of her. She has to kind of relearn the rules of the world and then kind of find her place in that new context. Like, who is Vivenna if she is not the perfect older sister? Who is she if she is not the betrothed queen to the god king of Halandran? And she goes through a lot of different kind of personas or identities throughout the course of the story. She becomes an expatriate rebel who is kind of gathering criminal forces in the city to incite a rebellion against the God King in order to undermine his military and try to protect her home country that way. She becomes homeless. She becomes a prisoner. And by the end of the story, she becomes kind of an outlaw and an adventurer who has no formal political ties to anywhere. And so there's this whole question in the story of like, what is your duty and how does that inform your identity on a kind of larger scale? And so Vivenna constructs her identity around that duty of saving her country from the God King by marrying him, by strengthening the bonds between the two countries, by forming a family, but also leveraging the power that would give her to kind of save her people. And once that's taken away from her, her lack of a duty in the story, like suddenly there's like a reversal, right? Like Ciri has no duty. And so that's why she's all loosey-goosey. That's why she acts out so much. But then when she is sent off to be the one who marries the king, suddenly Vivenna is the one who has no duty. And she doesn't understand who she is if she doesn't have a duty. And conversely, Ciri doesn't understand who she is if she does have a duty. And so Ciri tries to imagine, like, what would Vivenna do? Like, how would she deal with this stuff? And she tries to control her emotions the same way that Vivenna would. And she tries to be polite and formal the way that Vivenna would. And she just tries to like do the opposite of whatever it feels like she would usually do. Suppress her reactions and try to adopt the persona of her responsible older sister, which, of course, completely fails. She doesn't know how to do that. That's not who she is. And it turns out that would have been a terrible thing, probably. Like, if everything would have gone according to plan, then probably there would have been a huge war. Probably Vivenna would have ended up dead because she holds on so tightly to her biases and beliefs, to her contempt for the people of Halandren. And she's like kind of smug and superior, but I think all of that comes from a place of being afraid to unlearn this bigotry because it will force her to evolve into a different kind of person. And that's like really, really risky. Without this inciting incident of being stripped of her duty, she never would have chosen this, I think. And so when Ciri goes to court, she starts to enjoy the beautiful dresses, all of the different colors, the delicious food, the cool parties and entertainments. But she also longs to like have a purpose beyond just being I think they call her the vessel, which is so like messed up and bad that she just exists to make a baby with the God King. So they call her the vessel. And she's like, well, what's my job beyond being the vessel? Like, what am I supposed to do? And they're like, just do whatever you want. What do you mean? What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to just like kick back, relax, and party. And suddenly she's like, no, I don't want to do that. It was actually kind of the friction that she was getting from her conservative family in the mountains that was causing her to be like, all I want to do is party and kick back and have no responsibilities. But once somebody gives her this thing that she wants, suddenly she realizes that she doesn't want that actually she wants something deeper than that. But nobody's going to give that project to her, and she's going to have to find it on her own in the story. And so I think her story, has to do with finding meaningful connections and learning to pursue the things that she has an interest and passion in on her own and for her own sake. And so what ends up happening is she meets the God King, and I think he's really been set up to his reputation echoes our experience of the Lord Ruler in the Mistborn series, that we had this kind of God Emperor of the final empire, and he was a terrible person who executed his citizens in a callous and sadistic way. And then he, was murdering people by the hundreds and stuff. There was like all of these rebellions against him that he put down personally, killing so many people and having this just terrible kingdom to live under. And that is the way that Sisebron is characterized to Vivenna and Ciri before they come to the kingdom. But when Ciri actually meets Sisebron, he is like the most naive, sweetest, softest person in the story. He's extremely vulnerable. We find out that he doesn't have the ability to speak because his tongue has been cut out by his priests, but he doesn't blame the priests, and he thinks that they did the right thing to do that. And so there's another feeling there, a kind of connection between these women were brought up in their religion and in their kingdom to have a deep bigotry and contempt for Halandren. And that feels like a type of abuse that was perpetrated on them by their religion. And this also feels like an abuse that was perpetrated on Sisebron by his religion, that they have both kind of come to accept that, well, this was just the right thing to do. Of course, they taught me right and wrong. They taught me that, to dress in conservative colors is right, and to have bright colors is the greatest evil that a person could ever do. I think there's a reason that Sanderson chooses this kind of absurd comparison in that way, that it's good to have my tongue cut out by my priest. That's completely appropriate and good. We can just automatically know as readers, that's messed up. That's not okay. And so this isn't shades of gray. We're not trying to kind of move the needle on, a particular kind of thing and be well, I could see an argument for this or that. It's like wearing bright colors is evil. What? What? That's what your religion is about? And I think that's so we don't get confused, so that we can see very, very clearly what's happening here symbolically. This is about how institutions don't treat people like people. They treat people like instruments of the institution. So they need to craft these princesses to serve the ends of the institution's goals. And it's the same thing for Cosmere. In other words, we talked about duty and identity and the interplay between those things, right? The institution wants to reduce the individual solely to their duty. That's all that Cosmere is to his empire, to his kingdom, is the God King. That's it. That's the only thing he's good for. There isn't a room for him to have a personality or to have goals or desires or whatever. And it's the same thing for Vivenna and Ciri. Vivenna was brought up, to do all this diplomatic stuff that she's supposed to do. And that's the entire point of her life. And what did she want for her life? It doesn't matter what she wanted. And what if we allowed her to kind of learn about the people on the street, a face-to-face meeting between her and Halandran people and getting to know them in a deep way, learning about their culture, eating their food, wearing their clothes. That would really interrupt her ability to reject their culture and save her kingdom. And so it's important to build a hatred in her for that culture so that she protects the culture that she's from. So she needs to be crafted into the instrument that will best serve the institution. And so that means that she needs to be filled up with bigotry and hatred. And we've seen in Elantris and in Mistborn a kind of cynical use of religion to instrumentalize people to achieve the goals of the religion, right? That's the entire way that the Lord Ruler deployed his religion. It was really logistics network for distributing the resources of his empire to his people. And we saw in Elantris with Rathan that his relationship with his religion was, instrumentalized the people that he interacted with in order to expand the global political control of the religion over people. And so he would, convert a king in order to turn an entire nation to the goals of his religious order. Not because of a sincere belief in the religion as a core truth, but as a means to the ends of expanding the religion to every country in the world, which is supposed to trigger the prophecy that brings back their God. So we've seen this kind of thing. This is a theme in the Cosmere. As much as these books, talk about faith and hope and have a religiosity kind of built into them, and we even deal with gods and stuff. I haven't gotten to the gods at all in this book yet, so we'll get there. But for all of that, when we deal with formal religions, Sanderson doesn't shy away from showing, all the warts and imperfections of those institutions and the kind of negative effects that they can have on people's lives, the abuses that they can perpetrate. And I think in a lot of ways, they're no different from the kind of the other institutions of government and, political entities that are in his books as well. So a kingdom can be just as cruel as a church. There's just a certain kind of hypocrisy to the church exploiting people that might be different or feel different than a kingdom. But a religion has a special access to that interior sense of identity, right? And this book is so concerned with the interplay of, institutions and identity and all the different ways that identity is constructed that I think it's worth pointing out how Sisebron's religion has mistreated him, even though he is like the most important person in it and maybe the most powerful person in the world, according to their religion, but he's still like terribly abused. And not just in terms of like they cut his tongue out, but that he's kind of a prisoner in this. I mean, it's a very lavish prison, but he's not allowed to leave the palace. He's not allowed to really govern his country at all. All of the duties of the day-to-day government are delegated to the other gods in his kingdom. And really, those duties are executed by the priests and priestesses of the pantheon of like the court of the gods. And so it's not even the gods who are in charge of this. Like, this entire thing is kind of like a theocracy, right? Like, there's all these gods and they sit at the head of the government. But at the same time, they're really just kind of like figureheads and prisoners who exist there to be paraded in front of the common people, and everything else is kind of administrated by this bureaucracy of priests and priestesses and monks and so on and so forth. So it's kind of the religious order in Halandren is running the show in a lot of ways. But when Ciri interacts with Sisebron, she realizes, of course, that he can't speak. And then she teaches him how to read and write, and that allows them to communicate. And there's this very sweet and slow getting to know each other and sharing of vulnerability, learning about each other's past, spending time together each night, and a building romance between them that blossoms into a real marriage. And it feels, there's echoes of it to me of Raoden and Serene from Elantris, where, like they were married before they ever met each other. And Serene also didn't exactly know what she was getting into. And when she came, from her conservative kingdom to the big scary city where the Elantrians used to rule, but now it's like a bizarre cursed place, her husband is dead, right? And then she comes to find out that Spirit was really her husband, and this guy who she didn't like at first and was scared of, and he was a gang leader and a bad person, but she had this attraction to him, and what is going on? And she learns more about him, and then boom, he's the guy, and she was always married to him, and so it was okay to be attracted to him. And at the end of the day, it all ends up being okay once Raoden is healed. There's something similar going on, I think, with Ciri and Sisebron. It feels like an echo of that story. But there's, like I said, the shades of like the Lord Ruler. We kind of like use the specter of the tyrant God King to create an expectation that then gets thwarted. And it's kind of funny to find out that, like, you have this, you're expecting this dark god, and then you get this kind of cinnamon roll of a guy, and you're like, oh, he's such a sweetie. So it's fun the way that I think Sanderson is using the expectations that he's taught us from the previous books and inverting those, creating twists within the larger narrative of the books kind of creating archetypes or tropes, Cosmere archetypes, and then thwarting those things. And so keeping the story fresh by taking elements that we're familiar with and then recombining them in novel and unique ways is going to be kind of a hallmark, I think, going forward. He's not merely repeating himself, or when he does repeat himself, I think it's really significant and something that we should pay attention to symbolically. But a lot of times he's messing with our expectations. He's setting us up for the Lord Ruler, but then he's giving us someone more like Raoden. And I really like the discussions that Sisebron and Ciri have around language. It's reminiscent to me of the kind of central problem in Elantris, that way that language was divorced from a very concrete, clear relationship with the land. And then once that gap was closed, that's when the magic reactivated. And so there was this absence of distance between the signifier and the signified that I talked about in Elantris. That whole thing is turned on its head here, where there is a broadening of the ambiguity of language and a delight that can be found in speaking sarcastically, in flirting, in saying the opposite of what you mean, and all of the ways that language can kind of dance around the direct meaning of things. And Sisebron feels frustrated by that, but then starts to understand the game of it. And he comes into a deeper appreciation of language. But that ambiguity of language is really, really important when it comes to the magic system on this world itself. And so that's worth talking about if we keep Elantris in the back of our mind, because it really feels to me like the magic system in Warbreaker is something like computer programming language, especially when we're dealing with the kind of like undead creatures, or not the returned. I can't remember what they're called all of a sudden, but the like undead soldiers, or there's a squirrel that's brought back to life kind of. And they give them these kind of like password phrases where they say the phrase, then they give the directions, and then they say the phrase again. And that kind of brackets the instructions so that the creature does not get confused about what its purpose is. And that really, really reminds me of the different bracketing structures that you use in computer coding, in how you have to use particular commands, depending on the coding language that you're working, that will execute in a very particular way. And you can't just make up commands or generally like kind of vibe code it. If you're doing hard coding, you have to use the right command to execute the right result, or the whole thing is just gonna not work at all. And that's kind of how the magic system works. You can't just tell the inanimate objects, do this or that. You have to use the correct command. It has to be, like hold things, or attack, or protect, or whatever. And the real trouble starts to happen when you say something like protect, because there's ambiguity there in terms of, what exactly is a threat? What exactly are you being protected from, and how? That protection could come in a way that might do you harm, or might be misperceived as like, oh, this was a threat over here, but it actually really wasn't. Because the language is just kind of inexact. And if you compare it with the Elantris system that is also concerned with language, that had a high degree of like exactitude to it. Like Raoden had to do all these particular modifiers when somebody had a part of their body injured. He couldn't just like do the magical symbol that says healing. He had to do like, heal this part of the left leg of the person in particular, and it had to be like right on the nose, exactly correct, or the magical energy just wouldn't do anything. In this case, though, it feels a lot more like the internal intentions of the awakener have a much greater degree of control over what happens than the exact language that they're using. So the language is important. You can't just give any old command, but what you feel and think and intend on the inside has much more of an effect on the outcome. And that feels really related to the way that magic worked in Mistborn, where it was, you're steel pushing or whatever through the air, and then you choose to flare your metals and you push like extra hard, or as you push really, really hard, you pull just a little bit so that you go a little bit in this direction or that direction. And so it's not 100% pull, 100% push. It feels like there's a gradient there that you can do degrees of, and that you can even go past 100% when you flare your metals or you use duralumin. And all of that is calibrated by your internal intentions. And so there's a kind of blending of these two ways of interacting with the magical systems that we've experienced so far in the system in Warbreaker, where there's the internal part of it is really important, but the words are also essential and key. And the effect of the magic is really interesting. Not only are we bringing these creatures back from the dead and able to give them orders, but inanimate objects that are made from what was living material, so things like cloth or rope, are able to be animated and then given various commands that have all kinds of fascinating effects. And we haven't seen anything like that in either of the magic systems before this. And so the three magic systems that we have experienced now feel really distinct from each other. Allomancy, I kind of lump allomancy, feruchemy, and hemalurgy all together. And I know that that's not totally correct to do, but you get what I'm saying, that like they all have to do with metals kind of, and they all have this kind of pushing and pulling that they're concerned with, and that the internal intentions of the allomancer or feruchemist are what govern the use of the abilities. Whereas in Elantris, it's the language that governs everything. And the power of the door is like very remote and very focused in on particular individuals who only have access to that, and it can't be shared or distributed to anybody else. Here in Warbreaker, it seems like everybody has a little bit of magic that they are born with, and then that can be traded and accumulated by any given individual and then used in all kinds of ways, either by keeping it in yourself and having various innate powers that are just kind of passive, like hearing perfect pitch or seeing perfect color, and then on, where you are able to awaken objects or awaken undead servants. But also, just like in Elantris, we see that some people come back from the dead and seem to have been invested with some kind of supernatural power. But in Elantris, Raoden could remember his previous existence before, his transformation. But it seems like with these people, they actually do go through a death event. And then when they come back from that, it physically changes them. Like they literally kind of look different. And then they also don't have any memory of their past. And in Halandren, these people are worshipped as gods, and they have a special ability of, like I said, everybody's born with a little bit of magic to them and they can give that away and it can be accumulated. Well, if the gods give away their magical breath, then it will heal a person miraculously. And so the way that we learn about all of that is by following one of the other POV characters who is Lightsong the Brave. And you can see right in his name, he is named after his job, after his duty, that he is the god of bravery. And that is everything that you need to know about him as far as the church is concerned. And that is his whole identity. And a lot of his story, he's trying to find out who he was before he died. In other words, he's trying to get in touch with some kind of core identity, like that idea that I think we have in our culture that you could just kind of be dropped into any context and you would be the person that you are. There's something essential about you that, is unavoidable and will express itself in any context. That's what Lightsong is looking for throughout the story. And he's constantly asking, like, who was I? Because he wants to get in touch with who he really is. He innately rejects this idea that he is Lightsong the Brave or that he is a god. All of these institutional kind of designations for his identity, he says like, no, that's not real. And instead, he's like very inwardly focused and trying to figure out what his identity is. And it's really like a kind of comedy version of Rathan's story from Elantris, where he's very like inwardly focused and he goes through this entire journey of learning to reject his religion and kind of transcend its rules. Lightsong is just like there right away, and he's just constantly being a kind of slacker god. Or it's also the kind of thing that Sazed went through as well, right? Where he had his crisis of faith and he's just like rejecting all of the religions that were so important to him. And then eventually he actually does become God. And so the whole time Lightsong is like, I am not a god. You should not believe in me. I don't believe in me. Like, what are we even doing here? And so Lightsong doesn't know who he is, but he definitely knows who he is not. And I think you can see that with Ciri and Vivenna too. They have a kind of searching out of who they are in terms of their identity, but there's a kind of negative searching that goes on with that, where they're like, well, this is who I'm not, this is who I'm not, this is who I'm not. And you're kind of like coloring in all of the negative space, and it reveals the positive qualities of what is essential, I guess. But when those gods give up their breath, this ends up killing them. And so they kind of sacrifice themselves in order to deliver a miracle for their followers. And this would also like kind of bolster the institution of the religion at large and the kingdom itself. And so the gods are instruments of the institution in that way. They deliver this kind of unique service to the community, and they are cultivated and taught that this is like the thing that they are for. And a lot of pressure is put onto them to deliver that miracle to someone at some time. And I think a lot of Lightsong's rebellion against his persona is kind of pushing back against that choosing of like mortality or sacrifice. But at the end of the day, he, after rejecting what the religion says that he is, he has to find a way to construct and find out who he really is in an essential way. And he figures out that he's a person who cares about the truth and who cares about, testing out theories and uncovering mysteries. And ironically, he sacrifices himself for the head of the church, the God King, to restore his ability to speak. He heals his severed tongue and sacrifices his life so that Sisebron can stop the rebellion that is going on in the palace that is a coup that is also kind of a conspiracy of treason to start a war between Halandren and Ciri and Vivenna's kingdom. And so this third party kind of wants to set the two sides against the middle so that once the two of them have fought it out, they can take over the land where their people were the natives of the tropical area that the Halandran kingdom is now in, and they just want their land back and to kick out these people who have been here for 300 years now. Well, all of that is able to be overthrown and the war is able to be stopped because Lightsong fulfills his duty according to the parameters of the church and like even sacrifices himself not only for the good of the nation, not only for the good of the religion, but for his God. And he does all of it while rejecting those institutions and not believing in the God as a, like supernatural deity per se. Instead, he does it because he believes that it's the right thing and that Sisebron is going to save the people that Lightsong himself cares about. And so there's, again, that following of personal conscience and a disregard for, the institutional goals and propriety. But I think what's interesting is that there's like an overturning of the religion. There's an overturning of faith, a rejection of all of that kind of stuff. And that is not characterized as bad in the story. Where I think previously, in the last book of the Mistborn trilogy, faith and hope were like central pillars of what goodness was in that story. And so it's a little bit, as much as I'm claiming, there's these hard categories of good and evil, that doesn't mean necessarily that they translate from book to book very cleanly. Faith for the faith, for the sake of faith, or hope for the sake of hope is not necessarily the right thing all of the time. But I think stopping a war is a good thing in this context. And so like the war is a bad thing. The bigotry and the hatred is a bad thing in this story. And the peace, the learning about other cultures, the kind of interplay between the different cultures, the things that they have in common, the ways that they can live together, those are all good things. And so the bad or the evil in the story is located in the ways in which we are kept apart, or the ways that we are taught to hate each other in the story. And so that brings me to like the grumpiest character in the Cosmere, Vasher, who has his sidekick Nightblood with him, the talking sword, which is like such a cool, crazy idea. And so this thing has been invested with a huge amount of magical breaths, which has brought it into a kind of sentience. But Nightblood suffers from that ambiguity of language that we talked about, where, he was brought to life, so to speak, with the command of destroy evil. And that is like, what is evil, right? That gets right at the thing that I'm talking about with these categories of good and evil, and the way that this story is really blurring some of those things. Because Nightblood, when he is unleashed, destroys everything. And so is there a perspective to which, goodness and evil are relative? That way that I was saying, like, through the perspective of ruin, murder seems wonderful. Does that mean that murder from some kind of relative perspective could ever be good? Can the universe be evil if you are looking through the eyes of Nightblood, so to speak, because he destroys everything that he comes in contact with? It doesn't seem like that's the case. I think how the characters feel about Nightblood and how we experience him is that Nightblood feels evil, right? I love Nightblood. He's hilarious, but he's really, really scary also. And the degree to which he destroys things is frightening and feels like something beyond just a misunderstanding of language or some kind of naive, innocent confusion. Instead, it feels like there's something essential about what Nightblood is that is wrapped up with a real polarizing of evil in the Cosmere. And so he's constantly wanting to be taken out. He's always pushing for Vasher to murder people instead of, knocking them out or talking to them or sneaking around. And it reminds me of the things that Ruin was saying to people, in the previous Mistborn book of like, you should kill him now, and things like that. Except that when Nightblood says it, he's really naive and innocent about it. He thinks that it's like helpful, good advice because he doesn't understand what evil is in any context. And I don't think he could ever think of himself as evil. Like that would never even occur to him because he exists in order to destroy evil. And so how could he himself be evil? And so again, we're kind of taking something familiar in this, whispering to people, you should kill him like Ruin does, and then just tweaking it and playing with it and messing with it. And so it takes it out of feeling like this very sinister kind of thing, and it makes it funny, but I think it is located in an essential kind of association with actual evil in the Cosmere. And I think part of what makes Nightblood evil in his very nature is that he is literally an instrument that was created to do a particular duty. In other words, he's not fully a person. And part of that has to do with, not being embodied in the same way that a person is. He doesn't have his physical form is a weapon. And so his purpose is his form. And so he is naturally destructive and an instrument of killing. But that means that there's a limit to him where I don't think that he can kind of come into contact with that ability to transcend or become a paradox or ever get past his self-identity with his duty. He can never transcend the order to destroy evil, in other words. And so in the story, Vivenna is able to completely transform by the end of the story, where she goes from this very conservative, bigoted person at the beginning of the story who is in a crisis because of her need to have a role and duty in the world. And then at the end, she is a freewheeling adventurer who has no responsibilities and doesn't want any responsibilities. So she's able to totally transcend what she was made to be, if you will, and has remade herself into something totally different. Nightblood is never going to have that kind of self-mastery. He's never going to have that ability to transcend in that way. And I think that is what makes him evil. There's something being said here about, what is evil? It is being trapped in your duty. And if you think back to, Ruin and Preservation in the Mistborn story, they were also kind of trapped. The personas that were associated with them were hedged in by what the disposition of their kind of God nature was. Ruin could not transcend being Ruin. What made Vin heroic in the story was that she could take the power of preservation and use it to destroy and ruin. So she could kind of take that power and use it in the opposite way that it's kind of intended or predisposed to be used. And so being trapped in the duty or the archetype has something to do with kind of badness in the Cosmere or dysfunction. It's problematic. And so, when Sisebron breaks out of his duty by regaining the use of his tongue, when Lightsong breaks out of his duty by going into the underground tunnels and uncovering the conspiracy, these are the moments where we're transcending our duty and we're moving into the heroic. This is where the good in the story is located. And so it's telling us something about, what is good and what is evil in this universe. And it's keeping within the themes of this particular book as well, because they're redefining their identity by doing those things. They're just kind of remaking themselves into a totally different person. And you really see that with Vasher at the end of the story, right? Like he literally transforms into a different person at the end there. And there's this whole thing of like Vasher having many different names. And I think that shows the way in which he has had many different duties throughout his life, but he has kind of passed through them and is still on a journey of like trying to figure himself out. And he feels this responsibility for all of the effects that he has unleashed in the world that had these unintended consequences that he couldn't have anticipated. And so he feels that his duty is to kind of right the wrongs that he has been involved with to whatever degree he's able to, in the aftermath. But he's not doing that through any formal institution. And so a lot of his efforts are located in, kind of grassroots movements or individualistic crusades that make him a real outsider. He can't hook up with institutions because he has this experience of like, oh, every time I work with an institution, it ends up ruining, whatever thing that I'm trying to do. And so he wants to build an institution that has to do with like learning and justice and goodness. He creates this kingdom, and what does it do? It goes to war with every other kingdom around it. What does the knowledge get used for? It gets used for killing and destruction. And so he needs to break off from these institutions and not leverage them to achieve his goals. Instead, he has to kind of be an outsider all the time so that whatever the effect that he has on the world is kind of better contained and not amplified by the institution that, he's building along with. But like I said, he literally transforms at the end of the story. He becomes a different person. It's revealed, all the secrets and the big twists. But symbolically, what's going on there is like his identity is extremely fluid, but it's the essential thing about Vasher is that he is composed around a feeling of regret with his past and a feeling that he owes it to the world to try and fix things, but that he has to do it alone. So I think this book feels like really distinct from the other two books. There's a brightness to this book. I mean, I guess because, all the bright colors, I guess, but it just has like a different emotional feeling to it. There's so much darkness in the first Mistborn trilogy. It's so heavy and tragic. And Elantris is almost like it's adjacent to a horror story. There's so much trauma and violence baked into that story, especially early on. But Warbreaker just feels more fun and a little bit more goofy. There's a lot more lighthearted jokiness to the story. And the world just feels, completely distinct and different at the same time, while still participating in a lot of the ideas and themes that we've explored and taking elements that are familiar from the other Cosmere stories and kind of remixing them and playing with them at the same time. And so we're getting something familiar, but we're getting something very new simultaneously. So that's a lot of fun, and it's really impressive, the way that Sanderson is able to deliver that experience, I think. And so the next book is going to be the massive, the huge door stopper, the the beginning of the Stormlight Archive, The Way of Kings, which is, I think, an instant fantasy classic in the, English language, American canon, however you feel the Stormlight Archive goes after this novel, the first one is really something special and huge and big. And so it'll take me a minute to get through that book. I have no idea how I'm going to be able to do a podcast about it. I've really been dreading it ever since I've thought up I should read through all the Cosmere books and talk about them. I'm a little scared of the Stormlight Archive and how I'm going to summarize that without spending 6 hours of my life talking into my phone. But I guess we'll see how it goes.